An elite grandmaster told a maid's daughter to play chess, only intending to mock her. But within minutes, her unexpected genius stunned the entire room. They thought it would be a joke. A grandmaster, the pride of an elite chess club, turned to a maid's daughter hiding in the shadows and said, "Come now, child. Do you even know how to play?" The crowd laughed. It was supposed to be a spectacle, a lesson in superiority wrapped in polished arrogance. But what unfolded inside that room would silence 50 wealthy men and leave even the grandmaster himself trembling. It wasn't just a chess game. It was a confrontation between power and humility, pride and quiet genius. And what started as a cruel attempt to humiliate a little girl ended as one of the most unforgettable battles ever witnessed on 64 Squares. This is the story of how a child no one was meant to notice rewrote all the rules. Just before we dive in, let us know in the comments where you're watching from today. We love seeing how far these stories reach. And make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss tomorrow's special video. Now let's jump back in. Enjoy the story. The little girl in the corner was a secret hidden in plain sight. Her mother was paid to be invisible, to quietly clean the messes of the wealthy. But tonight, her daughter was about to make a mess no one could ever clean up. The St. James Chess Society was not a place for children. It was a sanctuary of old money and older traditions, a place where whispers were as heavy as the velvet curtains that draped the tall, arched windows. The air itself seemed expensive, thick with the scent of aged leather from the Chesterfield sofas, fine cigar smoke, and the faint, sweet aroma of brandy. Crystal chandeliers, heavy with a century of light, dripped brilliance onto the polished marble floors. The only sounds were the soft click of ivory on wood, the gentle swirl of wine in a glass, and the low, confident hum of men discussing fortunes won and strategies planned. Susan Peterson moved through this world like a ghost. For 5 years, she had polished the ornate tables, emptied the heavy crystal ashtrays, and straightened the velvet ropes, her presence acknowledged only when something was needed. She was part of the room's fine furnishings, silent and efficient. Her work was a steady rhythm, a familiar dance of servitude that paid the bills and kept a small, clean apartment for herself and her daughter. Tonight, however, her rhythm was off. Her daughter, 10-year-old Clara, was with her. A sudden fever that morning had closed the school, and Susan couldn't afford to miss a shift, especially not on exhibition night. So Clara sat tucked away in a small alcove near the grand fireplace, a place Susan hoped was deep enough in shadow to keep her unseen. With her pale blonde hair catching the firelight and a large, worn book open on her lap, she looked like a small, forgotten doll. The book was not a children's story. It was a thick, leather-bound volume with faded gold lettering on the spine. Principles of Strategy, by a general whose name had been worn away by time. Susan watched her daughter from across the room, a familiar ache of love and worry in her chest. Clara was a quiet child, observant and thoughtful beyond her years. She had her great-grandfather's eyes, a calm, steady blue that seemed to see everything. Susan often felt that Clara understood the world in a way she never would. She just prayed that this world, this opulent, judgmental world of the St. James Chess Society, would not notice her long enough to wound her. But tonight, the club was buzzing with a different kind of energy. It was the annual charity exhibition, and their celebrity in residence, Grandmaster Julian Croft, was holding court. Croft was a man carved from arrogance. He was tall and impeccably dressed in a tailored suit that probably cost more than Susan's car. He moved with a practiced grace, his smile a sharp, polished thing he used like a weapon. He was a brilliant chess player, a genuine grandmaster, and he never let anyone forget it. The amateur mind sees only the next move. Croft was saying to a rapt audience of club members, his voice resonating through the room. But the master sees the entire symphony. He hears the music of the pieces long before the first note is played. He picked up a white queen, holding it up to the light. Chess is about intellect, but more than that, it is about breeding. It is about a certain quality of mind that, frankly, one is either born with or not. His gaze swept the room, a king surveying his court. The members, men in their 60s and 70s who had built empires of finance and industry, nodded in solemn agreement. They saw themselves in his words. They believed their success, their very presence in this room, was proof of their superior breeding. They treated chess not as a game, but as a confirmation of their own innate brilliance. They would boast about the rare sets they owned, the famous players they'd once shaken hands with, and the expensive tutors they hired for their grandchildren, who mostly hated the game. Susan continued her work, her movements small and quiet. She heard a member tell another, "Be careful with that set, Abernathy. It's a 19th century Staunton. A single piece is worth a fortune." Mr. Abernathy, a kinder-looking man with spectacles perched on his nose, simply nodded, his eyes on the game, not its price tag. Susan remembered teaching Clara how to play on a cheap plastic set from a thrift store. The pieces were light and hollow, and the board was a flimsy piece of cardboard that had started to peel at the corners. Her grandfather, General Peterson, had taught her the game on an even older, hand-carved wooden set that smelled of pipe tobacco and old battles. "The board is a battlefield, Susie," he used to say. "It doesn't care if your soldiers are made of gold or wood. It only cares how you lead them." This place, with its talk of value and status, felt like a betrayal of that memory. It had turned his beautiful game into just another way for the rich to feel superior. A sharp, cruel comment from a woman near the bar reached Susan's ears. "Honestly, I don't think the staff should even be allowed to handle the pieces. They're so clumsy. They simply don't understand their value." Susan's hands tightened on her cleaning cloth. She bit her lip and kept polishing, making herself smaller, more invisible. But she glanced over at Clara, whose head was still bowed over her book, seemingly oblivious. A fire of fierce protectiveness burned in Susan's heart. She had to keep her daughter safe from this. The main event of the evening was about to begin. Julian Croft stood before the large demonstration board at the center of the room. A beautiful, ornate table held a magnificent chess set, its pieces carved from rosewood and polished ivory. The crowd gathered around, their faces alight with anticipation. Croft's exhibitions were legendary. He didn't just play, he performed. And his favorite performances always involved a bit of public humiliation, cleverly disguised as an educational lesson. "Ladies and gentlemen," Croft announced, spreading his arms wide, "tonight, I wish to demonstrate a fundamental truth of our beloved game. The vast, unbridgeable chasm between natural talent and, well, simple enthusiasm." The crowd chuckled, already enjoying the show. They knew what was coming. Croft would pick some amateur from the staff or a junior member and systematically dismantle them, all while delivering a lecture on their every mistake. It was cruel, but they found it endlessly entertaining. Susan tried to melt into the shadows, hoping he wouldn't call on the new busboy or one of the younger waiters. But Croft's eyes weren't scanning the staff. He was scanning the entire room, his gaze theatrical, searching for the perfect prop for his lesson. And then his eyes landed on the alcove by the fireplace. They narrowed, and a slow, cruel smile spread across his face. It was the smile of a predator that had just spotted a wounded fawn. "Ah," he said, his voice dripping with false sweetness. "What do we have here?" Every head in the room turned. The collective gaze of 50 wealthy, powerful men fell upon the small, 10-year-old girl reading a book. Clara looked up, her expression calm, her blue eyes blinking in the sudden glare of attention. Susan's heart stopped. She felt a cold dread wash over her. "No," she prayed. "Please, no. Not her." "You there," Croft called out, pointing a long, manicured finger directly at Clara. "The little girl." "Yes, you. The maid's daughter. What is your name, child?" The silence in the room was absolute. Susan felt the stares like a physical blow. They were no longer looking at an anonymous cleaner. They were looking at a mother whose child was about to be used as a toy. "Her name is Clara, sir," Susan said, her voice barely a whisper. She stepped forward, trying to shield her daughter with her own body. "I'm so sorry. She was just sitting quietly. We'll be out of your way." Croft waved a dismissive hand at Susan, never taking his eyes off Clara. "Nonsense. She's not in the way at all. In fact, she is perfect." He turned back to his audience. "Ladies and gentlemen, what better way to demonstrate the concept of innate ability than this? Pure, untouched innocence." He then looked back at Clara, his smile widening. "Tell me, Clara, do you know how to play chess?" The question was a trap, and everyone knew it. If she said no, he would mock her ignorance. If she said yes, he would destroy her on the board. Clara looked not at Croft, but at her mother. She saw the fear in Susan's eyes. Then she looked at the crowd, at their expectant, hungry faces. Finally, She looked at the Grandmaster. "I know the rules, sir," she replied, her voice soft but clear. A murmur of amusement went through the crowd. The absurdity was delicious. Croft clapped his hands together in feigned delight. "Wonderful. Then you shall be my partner for this evening's lesson. What do you say, everyone? Shall we give the little girl a chance to play against a Grandmaster? A true life lesson in the making." The crowd applauded, some of them laughing outright. "This will be over in 5 minutes," someone whispered. "Poor kid. He's going to make her cry." "Oh, I couldn't, sir," Susan pleaded, stepping forward again. "She's just a child. She didn't mean to interrupt." "It is no interruption," Croft boomed, cutting her off. He was relishing the power, the drama. "Think of it as a contribution to the charity event. We will show these generous donors the beautiful, brutal hierarchy of the mind. A lesson for all." He gestured to the empty chair across the gleaming demonstration board. "Come now, Clara. Don't be shy. I promise to be gentle." His eyes twinkled with malice. "We wouldn't want to keep you from your studies for too long." More laughter. The insult was clear. Susan looked at her daughter, her heart breaking. She wanted to grab Clara's hand and run from the room, from the job, from all of it. But then she saw the look on Clara's face. The fear was gone. In its place was a quiet, unshakable calm. It was the look her great-grandfather had in all his old photographs. The look of a soldier before a battle he knew he could not lose. Clara closed her worn book, placed it carefully on her chair, and walked toward the center of the room. She was so small, her simple dress a stark contrast to the opulence surrounding her. She looked tiny as she approached the massive, ornate chess table. "All right, sir," she said, her voice steady. "If you insist." The room fell silent as Clara pulled herself up into the large leather chair. It was so tall her feet dangled a foot above the floor. The expensive, heavy pieces seemed enormous in front of her. They felt cold, alien, nothing like the worn, familiar plastic pieces she played with at home on her great-grandfather's old board. But as she looked across the 64 squares, a sense of peace settled over her. The board was the same. The rules were the same. The battle was the same. And a battle was something she understood very, very well. Julian Croft sat opposite her, a condescending smirk plastered on his face. He leaned toward the audience conspiratorially. "Now then," he began, his voice booming in the quiet room. "Let us begin with a lesson in the fundamentals. An opening, my dear Clara, is the first phase of the game. Do you know what that is?" "It's how you start," she said simply, her hands resting calmly in her lap. "Precisely. Very good." Croft beamed, as if she were a puppy that had just learned a new trick. "Now, I will demonstrate how a master thinks during the opening, compared to, well, someone with a more natural approach." He waved his hand dramatically toward the board. "The principles of chess are developed over a lifetime of study. Positional awareness, tactical vision, prophylaxis, these are not concepts one simply absorbs by osmosis." The crowd nodded, soaking in his supposed wisdom. Several members pulled out their phones, ready to record the quick, brutal lesson they were about to witness. This would be a story to tell for weeks. "Ladies first," Croft said with a magnanimous flourish, indicating that Clara should play as white. He leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms, the picture of relaxed superiority. He was already planning his first few condescending remarks. Clara reached forward with a small, steady hand. She placed her fingers on the pawn in front of her king. She paused for a moment, her blue eyes scanning the board, but not just the board in front of her. In her mind, she saw another board, a worn wooden one sitting on a small table in her great-grandfather's study. She could almost smell the pipe tobacco and hear his deep, rumbling voice. "Control the center, Clara. The center is the hill you must take to win the war." She pushed the pawn forward 2 squares. King's pawn to e4. A classic, the most common opening in all of chess. Croft let out a small, audible chuckle. "Ah, the king's pawn opening," he announced to the room. "The first move every beginner learns. Predictable, but respectable. You see," he said, addressing the spectators as he mirrored her move with his own pawn to e5, "the amateur mind defaults to what is most familiar. There is no subtlety, no deeper plan. It is a simple, linear thought process." Clara ignored him. Her world had shrunk to the 64 squares in front of her. She developed her knight to f3, attacking his pawn. It was a standard, solid move, the kind of move anyone who had read a single chess book would make. It was exactly what Croft, and everyone else, expected. Another textbook move, Croft narrated, responding with his own knight to c6. She is following a script. This is the difference between memorization and understanding. She is playing moves she has seen, but does she comprehend why she is making them? Does she grasp the intricate strategic dance that has just begun? He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a dramatic whisper. I think not. The game continued. Clara played bishop to b5, the Ruy Lopez. It was one of the oldest and most respected openings, but also one that was taught to children in their first chess lessons. Croft laughed, a short, sharp bark of amusement. Well, I'll be. She has stumbled into the Spanish game. How charming. Of course, he added quickly, stroking his chin. Knowing the first three moves of an opening and understanding its profound strategic implications are two entirely different universes of thought. But as the game moved past move 5, then move 6, a tiny, nagging feeling began to prickle at the back of Croft's mind. Clara's moves, while seemingly simple and by the book, were flawlessly accurate. Not just playable, but precise. There were no hesitations. No small, telltale signs of a beginner's uncertainty. Her pawn structure was perfect. Her pieces developed with a quiet, purposeful harmony. He had been expecting a blunder, a simple tactical mistake he could use as a teaching point. It hadn't come. Beginner's luck, he told himself. The first few moves of the Ruy Lopez are fairly intuitive. The real game has not yet begun. He looked up at her, studying her posture. Notice her form, he whispered to Mr. Abernathy, who was standing nearby. Her shoulders are tense. She is completely out of her depth. She has no idea of the storm that is about to be unleashed. But Mr. Abernathy, a keen player himself, was looking at the board, not the girl. And what he saw was not tension, but a profound, almost unnerving stillness. The girl's focus was absolute. It was the kind of focus he saw in pictures of old masters, lost in the infinite possibilities of the game. Her quietness was not the result of fear. It was the result of immense, disciplined restraint. By move 15, the game had transitioned into the complex territory of the middle game. The condescending lectures from Julian Croft had stopped. His tone had shifted from one of amused disdain to one of quiet, puzzled concentration. Every single move Clara made was not just correct, it was deeply principled. She wasn't just reacting to his threats, she was weaving a subtle, positional web of her own. She made a quiet pawn move, h3, a move that seemed small and defensive, but he saw that it prevented his knight from finding a key square and subtly prepared a haven for her king later in the game. It was a move of deep, prophylactic understanding. Interesting, Croft murmured, more to himself than to the crowd. He leaned closer to the board, his brow furrowed in concentration. She is avoiding the obvious tactical blunders. It seems her memorization skills are quite strong. But the crowd, too, sensed the shift. The atmosphere of light-hearted entertainment had evaporated. The jovial whispers had died down. Now, there was only the intense silence of a real contest. Several members who had been standing at the back of the room now pushed forward, their eyes glued to the demonstration board, trying to understand what was unfolding. They had come for a public execution. They were witnessing a genuine duel. Clara calmly castled her king to safety. The move was perfectly timed. Her rook now controlled the open f-file, and for the first time, Croft felt a shiver of actual concern. He looked at his own king, still sitting in the center of the board, and suddenly it looked terribly exposed. The position he had thought was dominant now seemed fraught with hidden dangers. That is a very strong move, he admitted, his voice tight. He quickly tried to recover his composure. Of course, even a novice can stumble upon a good plan occasionally. Luck is always a factor in any game. But he knew it wasn't luck. Not after 15 consecutive moves of such unnerving precision. This was not a script she was following. This was a story she was writing, move by move, and he was beginning to feel like he was losing the plot. He was Julian Croft, Grandmaster. He was supposed to be in control. This was his stage, his audience. Yet he found himself calculating variations with a seriousness he hadn't felt since his last World Championship qualifier. This was supposed to be a 5-minute showpiece. Instead, he was in a fight. And then, Clara played her next move. It was the quietest, most subtle move yet. She slid her queen's knight from d2 to f1. A knight on the rim is dim, as the old saying goes. It was a move that looked passive, almost ugly. A beginner's move. Croft almost smiled in relief. Finally, he thought. A mistake. She is retreating for no reason. He was about to launch into a triumphant lecture about the importance of active pieces when he stopped. He looked again. He traced the lines of force on the board. The knight on f1 wasn't retreating. It was repositioning. From f1, it could jump to g3, where it would not only defend her king, but also prepare a devastating attack on his own exposed monarch. She wasn't just thinking one or two moves ahead. She had seen the ghost of a threat that he hadn't even considered and was elegantly neutralizing it before it could ever materialize. His blood ran cold. He looked across the table at the 10-year-old girl. She sat there, perfectly still, her feet still dangling far from the floor. Her expression was serene. She wasn't looking at him. She was looking at the board, at the world she had created, a world he was only now beginning to understand was far more complex and dangerous than he had ever imagined. The crowd was growing restless, confused by the long pauses and the sheer length of the game. "What's taking so long?" One woman whispered to her husband. "Is he having trouble with her?" Croft heard the comment. Heat flooded his cheeks. His reputation, his entire identity was built on the idea of effortless superiority. And now, that identity was being systematically dismantled by a silent child in a faded dress. He looked at Clara's calm blue eyes and saw not the ignorance of a child, but the wisdom of an old soul. He was no longer playing against a maid's daughter. He was playing against an opponent, a terrifyingly strong opponent. His mind, usually a sharp, analytical engine, was clouded with a fog of disbelief and rising panic. The little girl's knight on f1 was like an indictment. It was a move of such profound and quiet genius that it mocked his own aggressive posturing. It was a move that didn't shout. It whispered, and the whisper was a promise of his own impending doom. He had to find a flaw. He had to reassert control. He was the Grandmaster. She was the maid's daughter. The natural order of the world depended on him proving this. He scoured the board, his eyes darting back and forth, looking for a weakness, a crack in her flawless formation. But there was none. Her position was a fortress, each piece defending another, all of them working in a quiet, deadly harmony. It was like trying to punch water. His aggression found no purchase. She must be cheating, the thought came, a venomous serpent slithering into his mind. It's the only explanation. He scanned the room, looking for any sign. A hidden earpiece? A Confederate in the crowd signaling moves? He looked at the girl. She was watching the board, her expression placid. There was no sign of deception. There was only the pure, unwavering focus of a true player. The cheating accusation died in his throat, choked by its own absurdity. The truth was far more terrifying. She was simply better. Meanwhile, Mr. Abernathy leaned toward a fellow member, his voice a hushed, reverent whisper. "Do you see what she's done? Look at Croft's bishop on c8. It's a prisoner. It has no squares. And his rooks are disconnected. She hasn't launched a single flashy attack, but she's methodically taken away all of his pieces' hopes and dreams. It's like watching an anaconda slowly squeeze the life out of its prey. It's devastatingly beautiful." Susan stood near the wall, her duster forgotten in her hand. Her fear had been replaced by a dizzying, heart-pounding pride that felt like it might lift her off the floor. She remembered one afternoon, years ago, when Clara was only 6. Her grandfather, General Peterson, had set up the old wooden board. He'd shown Clara a complex endgame puzzle. Susan had watched for an hour as the old man and the little girl sat in silence, just staring at the pieces. Then, without a word, Clara had reached out and made a single, perfect move. The general had leaned back, a slow smile spreading across his weathered face. He'd looked at Susan and said, "This one, Susie, she doesn't just play the game. She understands the soul of it. She has the patience for the long war." Susan hadn't fully understood then, but she did now. She was watching her daughter fight a long war, and she was winning. Back at the board, Croft was beginning to sweat. A single bead trickled down his temple, and he resisted the urge to wipe it away, knowing it would be a confession of his struggle. He had to do something. He couldn't just sit here and be slowly strangled. His reputation was built on daring, tactical fireworks. He needed to complicate the position to create chaos. In chaos, a weaker player might blunder. He pushed a pawn forward, a desperate gambit. It was a move that sacrificed a piece of his own defensive structure in the hopes of tearing open a line of attack against her king. It was loud, aggressive, and deeply flawed. To the untrained eye, it looked powerful. The crowd stirred, sensing a shift. Perhaps the Grandmaster was finally showing his true strength. Mr. Abernathy, however, winced. "Oh no," he murmured. "That's an act of desperation. She's provoked him into overextending. It's a trap." Clara looked at the move for less than 10 seconds. She had seen it coming 3 moves ago. Her great-grandfather had taught her about this kind of move. "When your enemy is desperate, he will hand you a sword," he used to say. "Do not be afraid to take it." She didn't take the bait immediately. She didn't capture the offered pawn. Instead, she made another quiet, infuriatingly calm move. She tucked her king away from G1 to H2. It was a simple sidestep, but it rendered his entire attack toothless before it even began. She was refusing to engage in his chaotic brawl. She was sticking to her plan. The crowd didn't understand the move, but Croft did. It was the ultimate insult. She hadn't just seen his threat, she had dismissed it as irrelevant. She had looked at his desperate, screaming charge and calmly closed the door. The foundation of his confidence, the very core of his identity as a brilliant attacker, shattered. He felt a hot flush of shame. He was being taught a lesson, not in front of a few students, but in a room full of the city's most powerful people. His mind began to unravel. He was no longer thinking about winning. He was thinking about surviving, about not losing in a humiliatingly quick fashion. He looked across the table at his tormentor. Who was she? Where did this impossible knowledge come from? No child could possess this level of positional understanding. It wasn't something you could learn from a book or a computer. It had to be lived. It was the wisdom of a long and storied life, somehow contained in the small frame of a 10-year-old girl. He was forced into a series of defensive moves, each one more passive than the last. He was no longer the aggressor. He was the one reacting. With every move, Clara's pieces gained more space, more power, more control. Her knights found perfect outposts. Her rooks seized the open files. Her queen surveyed the board like a silent, all-powerful monarch, ready to deliver the final blow. The position on the board was now overwhelmingly in her favor. It was no longer a question of if she would win, but how. The members of the St. James Chess Society stood mesmerized. They had forgotten their cigars and their brandy. They were witnessing something that defied all their neatly ordered beliefs about class, intelligence, and breeding. They were witnessing a masterpiece being painted, not by the celebrated artist they had paid to see, but by the janitor's silent daughter. Croft knew he should resign. A player of his stature should recognize a lost position and offer his hand in a show of sportsmanship. But his pride, his raw, wounded ego, would not let him. He would make her play it out to the end. He would force her to deliver the checkmate, hoping against hope that she might, by some miracle, make a mistake. It was a foolish hope. Clara paused, her gaze fixed on the board. The final combination, the beautiful, logical sequence of moves that would end the game, had been visible to her for some time. It was like a constellation of stars in the night sky. Once you saw the pattern, you could never unsee it. She remembered her great-grandfather's voice, a low rumble in her memory. When the time is right, you must strike with decisiveness. No hesitation, no mercy. That is how you honor the game. That is how you honor your opponent. She reached for her queen. The room held its collective breath. This was it. The culmination of the long, silent battle. Croft's heart hammered against his ribs. He saw the threat, a dazzlingly complex sacrifice that would rip his king's defenses to shreds. Surely, she wouldn't see it. It was a combination that would be found in the games of world champions, a sequence so deep and counterintuitive that it bordered on art. Clara lifted her queen. For a moment, she looked up and her eyes met his. There was no triumph in them, no gloating. There was only a calm, quiet pity. And then she looked back at the board. She placed her queen on H6. The move hit the board with the force of a physical blow. It was a sacrifice. She was offering her most powerful piece for what appeared to be nothing in return. A gasp went through the crowd. Had the little girl finally cracked under the pressure? Had she made a catastrophic blunder? Croft stared. His mind, numb with fatigue and dread, struggled to calculate. If he took the queen, His pawn on g5 would be pinned, her rook would swing over to the h-file. His king would be trapped in a cage of his own making. It wasn't a blunder. It was brilliant. It was the most beautiful, most profound move he had ever seen played against him. It was a forced checkmate in 5 moves. He traced the sequence in his mind, his hands trembling slightly. Rook to h8, check. King is forced to g7. Knight to f5, check. King to h7. Rook to h7, checkmate. It was flawless. Unstoppable. A perfect, logical conclusion. Mr. Abernathy let out a low whistle of pure admiration. My God, he whispered to the man next to him. That's the kind of move they write books about. It's immortal. Julian Croft looked at the position. He looked at the sacrificed queen, a symbol of her utter dominance. He looked at his own king, cornered and helpless. He had been so wrong. He had thought chess was about aggression, about intellect, about proving you were better than your opponent. But this little girl had shown him something else entirely. She hadn't tried to crush him. She hadn't gloated. She had simply played the truth of the position. She had created art. He took one last, long look at the board, searing the image into his memory. Then, he slowly, deliberately, reached out and tipped over his own king. The soft click of the ivory piece hitting the wood was the loudest sound the St. James Chess Society had ever heard. I resign, Julian Croft said. His voice was a choked, hollow thing, stripped of all its previous arrogance. The words hung in the stunned, silent air. The great Grandmaster, the club's symbol of intellectual supremacy, had been defeated. Not just defeated, but completely, artistically, and irrevocably outplayed by a 10-year-old child they hadn't even known existed an hour ago. Clara reached her small hand across the board. Good game, she said, her voice the same soft, steady tone it had been all evening. Croft stared at her offered hand. Shaking it felt like the hardest thing he had ever had to do. As his fingers closed around hers, his face burned with a shame so profound it felt like a physical illness. A single, overwhelming question echoed in the ruins of his mind. Who are you? For a long moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. The only sound was the soft, almost imperceptible click of the fallen king on the rosewood board. Then, the silence was broken. Not by applause, but by a single, collective exhale, as if 50 men had just witnessed a miracle and were only now remembering how to breathe. The members of the St. James Chess Society stared, their faces a mixture of awe, confusion, and a dawning, uncomfortable shame. Everything they believed about the world, about their own place in it, had been turned upside down. They were men who dealt in absolutes, in numbers on a balance sheet, in the clear, sharp lines of power and influence. They believed that talent was a commodity that could be bought, that genius was a birthright of the privileged. But the truth they had just witnessed was far more radical. Genius could be found anywhere. It could be found in a quiet little girl with blonde hair, the daughter of the woman who polished their tables and emptied their ashtrays. Julian Croft remained frozen in his chair, his gaze fixed on his toppled king. The intricate patterns of the game, the beautiful, deadly logic of his defeat, were replaying in his mind on an endless loop. He had been so sure of his own brilliance, so wrapped in the cocoon of his titles and his reputation, that he had become blind. He had looked at Clara and seen a prop, a symbol of the uneducated masses he so despised. He hadn't seen the person. He hadn't seen the mind. And that blindness had been his undoing. The humiliation was a cold, heavy stone in his gut. It wasn't just that he had lost a game of chess. He had lost a part of himself. The arrogant, untouchable Grandmaster Julian Croft had died in that chair, and he didn't know who was left in his place. Susan rushed forward, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. She knelt beside Clara's chair, her hands hovering, unsure if she should hug her or shield her from the prying eyes of the crowd. "Clara, honey, are you all right?" she whispered, her voice trembling. Clara slid down from the high leather chair, her feet finally touching the marble floor. She looked up at her mother, and for the first time that evening, a small, childlike smile touched her lips. "I'm fine, Mom," she said. It was a good game. The simplicity of the statement was almost comical in its understatement. It was like watching a soldier step away from a monumental, history-altering battle and say, "Well, that was a busy afternoon." It was Mr. Abernathy who finally broke the spell that held the room captive. He was an old man with kind eyes and a genuine love for the game that transcended the snobbery of the club. He stepped forward, his expression one of profound respect. He didn't address the defeated Grandmaster. He didn't address the stunned crowd. He spoke directly to Clara. "Young lady," he said, his voice soft but clear. "I have been a member of this club for 40 years. I have seen some of the greatest players in the world sit at these tables. But I have never, ever seen a game like the one you just played. That was not just skill. That was art." He then looked at Susan, his eyes full of a new, respectful curiosity. "Ma'am, forgive my impertinence, but where on earth did your daughter learn to play like that? No tutor, no school could teach that level of understanding. That is a lifetime of wisdom in the moves of a child." Susan straightened up, pulling Clara close to her side. The fear she had felt earlier was gone, replaced by a fierce, protective pride. She was no longer just the maid. She was the mother of the girl who had humbled a Grandmaster. She looked at the faces around her, faces that had never truly seen her before, and she met their gazes without flinching. She was taught by her great-grandfather, Susan said, her voice ringing with a newfound strength in the quiet room. Her great-grandfather? Mr. Abernathy repeated, intrigued. Was he a chess player? A member of a club, perhaps? A sad, fond smile touched Susan's lips. "No, sir. He wasn't a member of any club you would have heard of. His name was General Marcus Peterson." The name fell into the silence, and for a moment, it meant nothing to the room full of financiers and CEOs. They were men who knew the history of markets, not the history of battles. But then, an elderly man at the back of the room, a man who had served in the military in his youth, gasped. "General Marcus Peterson?" he said, his voice filled with disbelief. "You mean the General Peterson? Old Iron Hands Peterson from the Ardennes campaign." "The very same," Susan said proudly. A wave of murmurs swept through the room as the name finally registered. General Peterson was a legend, a figure from the history books. He was a strategic genius, a man famous for his unorthodox, brilliant tactics in some of the most difficult battles of the last century. He was known for his calm under fire, his ability to see the entire battlefield at once, and his uncanny knack for turning a seemingly hopeless position into a decisive victory. His strategies were still taught in military academies. Mr. Abernathy's eyes widened in understanding. He looked from Susan to Clara, and everything suddenly made a brilliant, terrifying kind of sense. The calm, the patience, the deep, positional understanding, the refusal to be drawn into a chaotic brawl, the ability to see the long war, not just the immediate skirmish. It was all there. Clara hadn't been playing a game of chess. She had been commanding an army. He taught her everything he knew, Susan continued, her voice filled with emotion as she remembered the old man and the little girl bent over the worn wooden board in his study. He said the chessboard was the best training ground for the mind. He didn't teach her openings or memorized lines. He taught her principles. He taught her how to think. He would set up famous battles on the board, Cannae, Austerlitz, Gettysburg, and make her play them out. He taught her about controlling the center, about supply lines, about the psychology of a desperate enemy. He taught her that the best way to defeat an opponent is to take away their hope, move by move. Now, the crowd understood. They weren't just looking at a prodigy, they were looking at a legacy. They were seeing the mind of a legendary general, reborn in his great-granddaughter. The cheap plastic set at home, the worn book of strategy, it all clicked into place. She had an education far more profound than any expensive tutor could ever provide. She had been taught by history itself. Julian Croft finally looked up from the board. He had heard every word. The revelation was not a comfort. It was the final, crushing blow to his ego. He had been defeated not just by a child, but by the weight of history, by a strategic tradition that ran deeper and truer than his own flashy, tournament-tested skills. He had come armed with a rapier, all flair and speed, only to find himself facing an opponent who wielded the slow, unstoppable force of a glacier. He rose from his chair, his movements stiff and awkward. He walked over to Clara, his face pale, his eyes hollowed out by his defeat. He stood before her, the tall, impeccably dressed man and the small girl in the simple dress. The entire room watched, waiting to see what he would do. Would he lash out? Make excuses? Try to salvage some shred of his pride? But the arrogance had been burned out of him. All that was left was the raw, humbling truth of his own inadequacy. General Peterson, he said, his voice barely a whisper. I, I studied his campaigns at university. His book, Principles of Strategy, I've read it a dozen times. He looked at Clara, and for the first time, he truly saw her. He saw the intelligence, the history, the quiet, unshakable strength in her calm blue eyes. He was a genius. And so are you. He then did something that no one in the St. James Chess Society had ever seen him do before. He bowed. It was not a theatrical, sarcastic bow, but a deep, genuine gesture of respect. A bow from a defeated king to a rightful queen. You have taught me a lesson tonight that I will never forget, he said, his voice thick with emotion. I thought this game was about being the smartest person in the room. You showed me it's about seeing the truth. Thank you. Clara simply nodded, accepting his surrender with the quiet dignity of a person who understood victory far better than he did. The spell was finally, truly broken. The members began to talk, their voices a low, humbled buzz. They looked at their expensive chess sets, their crystal glasses of brandy, the opulent room that had always made them feel so important, and for the first time, it all seemed a little hollow. They had been celebrating the price of the game, not its value. They had been worshipping the symbols of intelligence, not intelligence itself. Mr. Abernathy stepped forward again. He smiled warmly at Susan. Ma'am, he said, on behalf of the St. James Chess Society, I would like to offer our most sincere and profound apologies for the discourtesy you and your daughter were shown tonight. He then turned to the other members. I think we have all been given a much-needed lesson in humility. Perhaps it is time we remembered that chess is a game that belongs to everyone, not just those who can afford a membership to this club. He then looked at Clara, a hopeful twinkle in his eye. Young lady, he said, we would be honored, deeply honored, if you would consider becoming a member of this club. As our guest, of course, for life. Susan looked at Clara, ready to politely decline. This was not their world. They did not belong here. But Clara looked around the room, at the ornate tables, at the beautiful, handcrafted chess sets that were works of art. She looked at the men, who now watched her not with condescension, but with genuine awe. Can I still play with my own set at home? She asked Mr. Abernathy. He chuckled, a warm, grandfatherly sound. Of course, my dear. You can do anything you want. Clara thought for a moment. Then she nodded. Okay, she said. But on one condition. Anything, Mr. Abernathy said eagerly. Everyone has to be nice to my mom, she said, looking directly at the woman who had made the cruel comment about the staff earlier. The woman's face flushed a deep, mortified red. Susan's eyes filled with tears. She pulled her daughter into a fierce hug, burying her face in her soft, blonde hair. In that moment, she was prouder than she had ever been in her life. Not because her daughter had won a game of chess, but because in the midst of her incredible, world-shaking victory, her first thought had been to protect her mother. And so, the evening at the St. James Chess Society came to an end. It had started as a night of arrogant spectacle and ended as a lesson in profound humility. The members would talk about it for years to come. The night a Maid's daughter, the great-granddaughter of a legendary general, sat down and quietly rewrote all the rules. As Susan and Clara walked home hand in hand through the quiet city streets, the cool night air felt clean and fresh. Susan looked at her daughter, whose small hand felt so warm and steady in her own. The world had tried to put them in a small, invisible box. But tonight, Clara had shown them that no box was strong enough to contain a mind that had been taught how to win a war. The game was over, but the victory, a quiet, beautiful, and world-changing victory, was just beginning. 6 months later, the St. James Chess Society was a different place. The scent of old leather and expensive brandy still lingered in the air, but it was now mingled with something new. The faint, sweet smell of lemonade and freshly baked cookies. The deep, reverent hush that once dominated the grand room was now frequently punctuated by the bright, clear laughter of children. The old members still sat at the ornate tables, but their conversations were different. Just yesterday, Mr. Abernathy had been seen patiently explaining the concept of a fork to a giggling 7-year-old from a local public school, his face alight with a joy he hadn't felt in years. They spoke less of their stock portfolios and more about the cleverness of a Sicilian defense or the beauty of a well-executed endgame. The soul of the club, once cold and hard as the marble floors, had begun to warm. At the center of this quiet revolution was Clara. She was no longer a secret hidden in an alcove. She was the club's heart. Twice a week, after school, she would arrive, her worn copy of Principles of Strategy tucked under her arm. The members, men who commanded boardrooms and steered global markets, would greet her with a respect and affection that bordered on reverence. They called her their little general. They had established the Clara Peterson Scholarship for Young Strategists, a fund to support children from all backgrounds who showed a passion for the game. The club, once a bastion of exclusivity, was now actively seeking out talent in places it had never bothered to look before. Susan Peterson no longer wore a cleaner's uniform. She was now the director of the youth program, a position the board had created specifically for her. She moved through the room not as a ghost, but as a respected administrator, her voice calm and confident as she organized schedules and spoke with parents. She found a particular satisfaction in reassuring nervous mothers and fathers from working-class neighborhoods, telling them, "Your child belongs here just as much as anyone." The fear that had once been her constant companion had vanished, replaced by a deep, unshakable peace. Sometimes she would pause and watch her daughter, surrounded by a crowd of adoring old men hanging on her every word, and a wave of pure, brilliant joy would wash over her. Her grandfather had been right. The board didn't care who you were, and now, finally, neither did this room. But perhaps the most profound change was seen in the man who had set everything in motion. Julian Croft was still a Grandmaster, but the arrogance was gone, stripped away, and replaced by a quiet, thoughtful humility. He had become Clara's most dedicated student. Every Saturday morning, he would meet her at the club. They wouldn't sit at the grand demonstration table. Instead, they sat at a small, simple wooden table in a quiet corner. Between them was not one of the club's priceless, museum-quality sets, but a simple, worn wooden set with smooth, lovingly carved pieces. It had been a gift to Clara from Mr. Abernathy, a replica of the one her great-grandfather had owned. "He is attacking on the flank," Julian said one morning, pointing to a position they had set up on the board. He was analyzing one of his own past games, a blistering victory from his arrogant youth. "I thought I was being brilliant. Aggressive. Overwhelming." Clara studied the board, her chin resting on her small hand. "You are," she said softly. "But you left your king all alone. Your soldiers are fighting a war far away, but they have forgotten to protect their home." She slid a black pawn forward one square, a tiny, unassuming move. "This little pawn, he is the start of the counterattack. While you are busy being brilliant over here, your whole kingdom is about to fall apart from the inside." Julian stared at the move. He had never seen it during the original game. He had been too focused on his own dazzling combinations, too in love with the sound of his own attack. But she was right. The quiet pawn move was the key. It was the beginning of a subtle, devastating collapse. It was the kind of move she had played against him. "I spent my whole life trying to be the most clever player," he murmured, looking at her with an expression of pure awe. "I never realized it was more important to be the wisest." "My great-grandfather used to say that a loud attack is for show," Clara said, her blue eyes thoughtful. "A quiet plan is for victory." Julian Croft smiled, a genuine, humble smile that transformed his entire face. "Your great-grandfather was a very smart man." "He was," Clara agreed, a fond look in her eyes. "But he also said that the most important thing he ever learned was from a mistake he made in his first battle." "What was that?" Julian asked, leaning forward, eager for the wisdom. As a young lieutenant, he was so sure of his strategy that he didn't listen to a warning from a local farmer who knew the terrain, Clara explained. He thought he knew better. His unit was ambushed, and he lost good men. He said he learned that day that true intelligence isn't about knowing all the answers. It's about being humble enough to listen to the person who does, no matter who they are. She looked at him directly, her gaze steady. He said you should never, ever underestimate your opponent, especially if she's a little girl. Julian let out a laugh, a real, heartfelt sound that echoed through the quiet room. It was the sound of a man who had lost everything he thought was important, only to find something far more valuable in its place. He looked across the simple wooden board at the 10-year-old girl who had become his greatest teacher. The game between them was no longer about winning or losing. It was about learning. It was about respect. It was about the quiet, beautiful, and endlessly profound journey across 64 squares. And for the first time in his life, Julian Croft understood that this was the only victory that had ever truly mattered. And that's where we'll end the story for now. What did you think of this journey? Have you ever experienced something similar, or discovered hidden meaning in an unexpected place? Share your thoughts in the comments below. I'd love to know what you were doing while listening. Maybe relaxing after work, on a late-night drive, or just winding down. I truly enjoy hearing your own stories. And if you want to make sure we cross paths again, hitting like and subscribing makes a huge difference. There are so many more inspiring journeys waiting to be told. Tell me, where are you watching from today? Remember, the people around us often carry extraordinary gifts we might never expect. Sometimes all it takes is someone believing in them. Until next time, keep your heart open to life's little surprises, and thank you for spending this time with me.